In the next large lecture, I'm going to be doing a number of segments on labor and the underclass. And to try and put that in perspective or in context of what we've done so far, let me remind everybody that we've talked now a bit about Reconstruction, but more specifically, we've talked about the transformation that occurs in the United States following the Civil War and Reconstruction through really the early 20th century. And this is an economic shift that occurs when we talk, for instance, about the rise of the corporation or industrialization. But alongside any kind of economic shift, there's always occurring cultural change and social change that correspond. And they all influence one another. So this lecture in particular, not just this segment, but more broadly the next series of segments that you'll be watching, I want to focus in these segments on the other side of the economic transformation. You've gotten some of that. I know that you've looked at lectures on the West and the South, and I hope that you've understood that the economic change of the latter 19th century is affecting regions of the country and different parts of the country in different ways. But mostly, we've focused on the sort of captains of industry. We've focused on the so-called robber barons of the Gilded Age. Well, in this lecture and the segments that it contains, I want to focus instead on what we might consider the underclass in America. For every captain of industry, Rockefeller, Carnegie, there's also, any number of workers who are providing labor for the factories that produce the goods fueling the United States' new manufacturing and industrial economy. By 1880, just to give you some sense of this, by 1880 there were nearly 5 million Americans who worked in manufacturing in this country. Now, a generation earlier, that number would have been about 1.5 million. And that just gives you a sense of the growth in terms of the numbers of people employed in manufacturing that had occurred just between the end of the Civil War and 1880, 1885. What's happening is a new form of production with its roots stretching well back into the antebellum period, an outgrowth, a further refinement of many of the ideas that were part of the Industrial Revolution. In particular, we can talk here in the late 19th century about mass production. In this process of mass production, the very process of production itself is divided into simplified tasks, usually very standardized tasks. And one way to think of it is making little parts into big parts. Your job, your action as part of this production process may only include one step in a much larger and more complicated process of putting together something like, an automobile, for instance. But the pieces and the parts have been broken down in the process. Now, there are a couple things to think about this, and I want to start out by suggesting sort of a story, to pin this with an individual. And the individual I've chosen is a fellow named Frederick Winslow Taylor. In 1894, Taylor had published a book called The Principles of Scientific Management. And key to the new corporate culture and key to the new economy of the late 19th century U.S. will be management processes, management skills. Really, it goes back to the railroads. And I'm sure that Melanie Story has talked some about this, but you begin to think about the management of these vast networks of railroads and what sorts of skills were required. And really, railroads provide an important basis for the development of corporations and the development of large-scale industry and mass production in this country. Not only in terms of management techniques, but also in terms of time management. And that's something I want to talk about in just a moment. But back to Frederick Winslow Taylor. Taylor was a management expert. a time management expert. He was, throughout the 1890s, really conducting experiments in how you could make the processes of manufacturing and industry more efficient. And he chose to break them down, to break the processes down into steps. In one instance, just to give you an example, he studied Bethlehem Steel and their processes for making steel. And he identified the elementary operations, and he used his stopwatch to time how long it took workers to carry out each step in the job they did. He then broke down the tasks that these workers were involved in and tried to see which tasks could be eliminated, thereby saving time. And he also looked at tools. In other words, could you improve the time element for a particular step if you had better designed tools for that purpose? The real key is efficiency. It's very much what this new management style is about. The management techniques are about how do you get greater efficiency out of production. Wasted time, put another way, means wasted money. If you've invested in machinery, and by the way, machinery is doing most of the work now, that's where much of the value added lies, then increasingly you're paying for that machinery, and when it's not running, you're losing money. To give you an example, back many years ago, I worked third shift, which is the night shift, in a plant, a factory that made electronics. Now, I admit that's no steel furnace. It wasn't particularly hard labor, but in fact, a lot of the processes and requirements were very similar. I worked on an assembly line. My job was to take small parts like capacitors and transistors and resistors, and well, I need to be careful here, because really it was the job of the machines. This was a heavily robotics-driven assembly line. And it was the job of the machines to place all those pieces onto motherboards to create a large end product. The capacitors and things, they were very, very small. What I was getting paid for really was not the skill necessary to place the various electronic pieces on the motherboard where they went. Rather, I was being paid to watch the machines and make sure they didn't run short of parts. But put yet another way, what I was really being paid for was my time. Part of this notion of efficiency is the management of time itself. And one of the fascinating things about the new American economy is the degree to which it affects conceptions of time. If you think about railroads again for just a moment, imagine that railroads not only conquer space, that they can get you from New York to someplace along the Mississippi River far more quickly than could a wagon and a team, or even a stagecoach, or even a boat for that matter, or ship. It's not just space, though, that's being overcome, because you're overcoming time. You've reduced the amount of time it takes to accomplish a task. Similarly, technology in the factory reshapes how people live their lives, what the expectations of workers are. And when I say that when I worked third shift, I was being paid for my time, many of you, and many people, in fact, have worked by the hour, right? Where you get paid by the hour. It's not our skills that we're selling, it's our time. Now, Frederick Winslow Taylor, his studies are about efficiency and therefore about time. How do you physically change the situation for a worker to make that worker even more efficient? The downside, of course, for the worker is, one, you can easily be overburdened. The stress of fulfilling the job can just wear you down. I had a professor once who joked about the speed of those old-timey films, the old black and whites, the early films that showed men working on assembly lines. And his joke was that the films did not speed up the pace of work, they reflected the pace of work. Human beings were being driven in ways they never had been before by the pace of the assembly line, the pace of the factory in the late 19th century.